Thank you for having me. It is great fun to be here. I love to talk about quilts, and I don't know that I'm all that knowledgeable, but I'm somewhat of a dinosaur. I started making them in the 70s, and I have been very fortunate to be in the right place at the right time, and have had some wonderful experiences with quilters and quilt makers and quilts. So Nan asked me just to kind of give a brief overview. Those of you who are quilters, this is going to probably be very simple. Those of you who are historians are probably going to know most of this anyway, but we'll give it a go. As you know, quilting, and I made notes because I can talk a long time and I'm trying to keep it brief. Quilting is the art of sewing 2 to 3 layers, usually 3 layers, a top, a bottom, and a middle, with a small running stitch. That's all there is to it. So we have today records of quilted garments dating from the Egyptians, like 3400 BC. In the British Museum, there is a carving of a pharaoh wrapped in what looks like a quilted something, robe or blanket. So it goes back forever, and I think the oldest textile that we know about right now is a quilted rug, because they used, houses were dirt, so they used rugs on the floor sometimes. And this was found in a cave in Mongolia, and it is dated from, the 1st century BC. Most people think quilting came from the East. Certainly the Chinese used it, the Mongolians used it, obviously the Egyptians, and probably with the trade routes into Europe in the early part of the Middle Ages, it became very common in that part of the world. The oldest quilt that I know about is in Sicily, and it dates from about 1400, and it is linen, top and bottom, and in the middle it's like a wool batting. And I believe there are 2 of them that were actually made for small beds and somehow have been preserved, which I think is really kind of amazing. Now, we know quilted clothing in the Middle Ages was worn by both the serfs and the aristocracy, though probably not the same quality of cloth. The people who were the serfs probably wove their own and put it together. And certainly royalty was able to bring in fabrics from other countries that were even more advanced than Europe in the Middle Ages, and have many wonderful kinds of petticoats and quilted jackets and things like that to keep warm. Because when you think about it, everything was pretty chilly and drafty. There was no central heat. So I always go back to the end of that. And actually, by the end of the 13th century, there are documented resources that list quilts in households that show accounts or inventories when somebody dies. So we know that it was widely used then. Bed coverings, flooring, quilting. No examples exist. Very few examples exist. But the earliest quilt that we think about in America was actually done in, I think it was written down in 1704. It was the then governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony actually listed a pieced quilt. I've seen a picture of it in magazines, and it's one pattern that's an overall pattern, so it's like a triangle done up and down. And it's really pretty. It's patterned fabric. It's bright colors, oranges and reds. But that was not typical of quilts in America. And I'm going to just real quickly digress and say that quilts come kind of in 3 major categories. And quilts are cyclical. What people do and how they did it varied from time to time. So you can have a pieced quilt, and that's when you sew lots of pieces together, and they either form an overall top, like sort of a tessellation, or you sew them into blocks, and you make as many blocks as you need to make the size of the quilt that you want. They can be whole cloth quilts, and many early quilts were whole cloth quilts. One piece of fabric that was decorated or sewn in really decorative motifs. So you could have a center, you could have all kinds of fancy stitching. And the third type of a quilt is an applique quilt. And that is when you cut up little pieces of fabric, or for those of us who have it anyway, we take our little scraps in our stash and cut it up. And those are usually pictorial designs. They have varied from, beautiful Baltimore album quilts with flowers and leaves to pictorial quilts, that sort of thing. So those are the three major categories of quilting. And I'm talking in really broad generalities, just so I can get up to Maureen and introduce her. And that isn't until the 1930s, and I'm still back in the Middle Ages, so we're going to move this along. And everything I say can probably be, you can find an example that is directly opposite what I'm saying, but I'm talking about the vast majority of quilts. And just as an aside, today quilts are studied as historical documents, which is fairly new, really just started in the latter part of the latter century. But we can tell from quilts sometimes where it was made and sometimes the kind of people who made them. So quilts help us identify, or I say us very loosely, historians and quilt study people who are very, very serious about this. This helps identify where they were from. You think of the Pennsylvania Dutch, the German background, and how their quilts are large applique pieces in bold colors. You think of the Amish, both in Ohio and Pennsylvania, who use very narrow color ranges, but it's absolutely exquisite quilting. It was all about the quilting, not all about the coloring, like the Pennsylvania Dutch were. So they tend to show and reflect a little bit of the area, plus the socioeconomic persuasion of the quilt maker, whether they were, wealthy, like on the eastern seaboard, or they were more settlers moving inland without resources. And I'm going to talk mostly about American quilts because that's kind of who we are and what we know about. We know we didn't start this, but certainly this country has been responsible for a tremendous outpouring of innovative design and patterning that created the quilt world we know today. Because as this country was settled, people came from Germany, Dutch, English, Scots, all of those people, and they brought with them whatever they could. I got to think coming to Plymouth and Jamestown was a little like Naked and Afraid. You were leaving cities with stores and shops, and you could go in a button shop or a ribbon shop, and all of a sudden there you are standing with some Indians, and it's cold, and you've got to figure out how to take care of yourself. So a lot of early quilts from the 1600s we don't know very much about. I'm sure there were quilts brought from Europe, and I'm sure there were a lot made from just patching anything together that you could for warmth. That had to be a little critical there for the first few years, maybe even the first 100 years. But anyway, the quilts that were probably made then all probably reflect back on the quilts that were being made in Europe at that time, in England. And the majority of those, again, sweeping broad generalizations, were whole cloth, strippy quilts maybe. The Welsh did lots of gorgeous quilting on strippy quilts, just big swaths of alternating fabrics. In England, the framed medallion was hugely popular. You'd have a center, and then you do rows of piecing or applique around it, and it grew from the center. The block quilts that we know so much today really stemmed more from this country as we became established and moved on. So that is I think, a significant heritage from American quilting. Now, in the beginning of this country, if you remember, the Navigation Act, 1650, anybody who likes history, is was established to have colonists make raw goods or create raw materials to be shipped to England to be manufactured into goods. We were then supposed to buy from England the things we needed in America. Well, needless to say, that didn't work real well. I mean, it went on for several other things and eventually a revolution. But probably initially at that time, the people who had come with grants and the ones that had money that were establishing Boston and Philadelphia and the seaports at the time, Manhattan, all of those, they probably made quilts very much like the English did, whereas the people who were braver and were moving out ended up having to spin, weave, and dye their own cloths, and probably those quilts were very much more basic. Simple, put together just to keep warm, to keep everybody from freezing to death. By the 1800s, though, after the Revolution, this country started manufacturing fabric, and we became absolutely as good as anything that came, bless you, from Europe. There is a gentleman called John Hewson, if you really get into this, who did absolutely gorgeous fabrics, and I believe they were copper plates. But anyway, there are some of his quilts in existence today. The one I know the most about is at Winterthur in Delaware. But he was credited with being the first person who could produce cloth of that quality. And that was not until, as I said, the 1800s. So during this time, it's sort of when America took her own look at making quilts. We just soared into quilt making. We were not as focused on what had happened back. We've been here now 150, almost 200 years. And so this was an exciting time in our history. This was a time when people were moving west. They were opening up new places, and they were just full of energy and excitement and enthusiasm. And it was a heyday for quilting. The idea of blocks being made smaller and reproduced in a whole-size quilt. You can imagine if you were going west in a covered wagon, even if it was only from Virginia to Kentucky, that you could work on something that was small, but you couldn't take your big frame and, let's say a 90 by 90 piece of fabric and work on that. So this became hugely popular, and it also, in the 1800s, became part of the socialization of this country. Quilting bees were extremely popular. They went with barn raisings and a whole lot of other things, but quilting bees were primarily by women, and needless to say, and they, the idea was you would bring your tops, you made your own tops, and you would come to somebody's house, and you would set them in a quilt frame, and everybody would quilt on them. So the idea of having quilts that multiple people have made, we get hung up on our teeny tiny little stitches, those of us who are traditionalists in quilt making. Well, you have to know that the young girls and the women probably didn't all do the same quality of stitching, but they needed the quilts, but they needed the warmth. They needed to have that available for them. And then when that was over, they'd put all that away, and then there would be food. Men may come, boys. I understand this was a big courting type of occasion, but it was also a time of singing and dancing and getting together. Unlike what we do today, those people may not have seen each other for a couple of weeks, and they may not have seen anybody outside of their own household for that period of time. Also, they had still, in the 1800s, had the legacy of the amazing needlework that was done in the 1700s. I kind of glossed over that because that was not necessarily the decade for the century for quilters, but it was a century when, in this country in particular, women went to school and were taught fine handcrafts. So they were exquisite stitchers. If you get the opportunity to see any of the quilts from the late 1700s, you will probably see some of the prettiest work that was ever done on quilts. They were absolute masters. They started quilting maybe when they were 3 or 4. I mean, Calvin Coolidge, I think, made a quilt when he was a boy of about 6 or 7. Everybody did. Husbands would cut out pieces. It was, again, the family keeping warm and the young girls having this exquisite ability, because they sewed every day for hours, to make gorgeous, gorgeous pieces. They learned design. They didn't learn reading or math particularly, but they certainly learned, I would say, the concept of geometry to be able to make their quilts. So the 1800s were really, when I think of American quilts, this is when I think our country soared. We were going west. We were creating patterns. The patterns that were created and the designs that were done were so exciting. If you look at Barbara Brackman's Book of Blocks, I would say that during the 1800s, the majority of them came in that time. You changed lines and you had a new pattern, or somebody from the Eastern Seaboard sent somebody out in Ohio a packet and didn't quite draw the pattern right, so when she made it, she'd created a new pattern. This was a huge time for that. It was a time of specialty quilts. Quilting became very innovative, and people became interested in aspects of quilt making. And it was also a time for people who weren't moving west, where you were a little more affluent. The trade was back up. You had goods on the Eastern Seaboard. Boats and ships came in and out. But in rural areas, for example, the autograph quilt was hugely popular. And that was a quilt where sometimes they paid, sometimes they didn't, but they'd write their name on a piece of fabric, and it was put in a quilt. And these quilts were usually given to people who were moving west, or the preacher who was being sent someplace else. It was, they were like sending a little bit of your love along with people. Other popular things during that time were the pictorial album quilts. And those are pictures, I know you've all seen some, depicting scenes, usually almost always applique, depicting scenes from the life or the times of the people. And some of them are very primitive, some of them are just the whole cloth done in applique. But they resonated with a certain type of quilt maker. There was a group that did this. Victorian Crazy Patch came in the late 1800s, and that just rocked everything. Everybody made Crazy Patch quilts that could afford the velvets, the silks, the ribbons, the beads. If you had that kind of affluence in your life, you made these quilts. And I think this is significant because they went from being anything of necessity to something simply of design. They weren't created to make anybody warm. They were created to put over the back of a settee or on the piano so people could see them when they came to visit and ooh and ah. I actually, going to digress 1 minute. I said I wouldn't tell stories, but when I first moved to Winston-Salem in 1980, the first show we ever did there, I met a gentleman whose family, for the previous 100 years, had been the boat keeper. They also had a big cattle farm, but their main job was ferrying people across the Yadkin River. And for those of you who don't know North Carolina, that's west of Winston-Salem, so if you wanted to go to the mountains, if you wanted to do anything like that, you had to get across the Yadkin River. And he told me, in this first show we did, we had 8 Victorian Crazy Patches that his mother and his sisters had made. And he said as he was a little boy growing up, he had to stay home and take care of cattle and do the things he was, supposed to do. But his mother and sisters visited. They got in their whatever kind of boats, and they went up and down the Yadkin and visited, and they might be gone a week or 10 days with somebody because it was much harsher travel. So they all took along these things and worked on them. And he still had 8 of the quilts that from that time that his family had, which I thought was just amazing. We were very lucky about that. So after the Victorian era, and these quilts were fairly dark. I don't mean depressing, because they had lots of going on, but they were dark. Queen Victoria kept all the colors pretty muted and down for her lifetime. So segue into the early 1900s, and now you have colors that are clearer and lighter and brighter all of a sudden. So this was an age of beautiful applique designed by women, and for the first time women sold patterns. Before that, in the 1800s, magazines carried patterns, newspapers had patterns all the time. No instructions, but just the pattern and maybe the shape of the pieces. By the 1900s, you could buy, for under $1, you could buy a bag of scraps from a newspaper ad and add to your collection. So this really became a huge time of scrap quilts. I know we all think of the Western people with their bags of scraps moving across the country. If you look at scrap quilts, somebody has to have a lot of quilts fabric, or a lot of fabric. These are mostly house dress fabrics or shirts to make a true scrap quilt. So really it wasn't until the early part of the 1900s that the scrap quilt craze took off. There are lots of scrappy quilts that you'll find from the late 1800s in particular, but when you get into the 20s, 30s, quilts are appliqued a lot, not all, but many, many applique quilts. You could buy a pattern, some with the cut pieces. I actually own a quilt that my husband's grandmother made before World War II. And she bought the kit from like Lee Ward's or Sears and Roebuck for $14, and she appliqued all the pieces onto this giant whole cloth quilt. So the things were very, very popular then. There was a tremendous interest in quilting, and I think that the women who have quilted in this country have always been artists, have always been creative. Some made do with so little, and others had access to so much that we have a hugely rich heritage of American quilt making. And it certainly has evolved, and what this country put into making quilts is very, very unique to America. So having said that, now we're at the Depression. And during the Depression, things changed back to the frugality of the early settlers and people who didn't have money and had to make do, traded things, and leading into Maureen, they, women are just so resourceful and creative. I love us. They would use things that ended up being virtually free or trading scraps with their friends. So if you could get a pretty fabric with a load of flour in it or feed for the animals, well, there you were. You had lots of cloth to make your scrap quilt with. So having said that, I'm turning this over to somebody who really knows about feed sacks and that era. I did bring a reproduction quilt top that I made out of, there may be a few pieces in it, but even this is the coloration of the kinds of fabrics that were used. And those of you familiar with, earlier quilts, they were more somber, darker. They were the colors of house dresses and men's work shirts. But this was after, in the early 1900s. There may be a few actual feed scraps in here. My sister-in-law gave me a lot of these, and she loved feed sack materials. So she was much more knowledgeable than I about this. And you're welcome to come look at this. And I thank you for listening.
Well, I think that Karen did a great job. She might have stepped on my toes quite a bit, but sometimes you need things to be repeated.
We're not taking notes, so we do need
Okay. All right. Well, all right. So feed sacks. I'm going to go back farther than the 30s. So when shipping and travel of goods like not peanuts, but nuts or seeds or grains or flowers or whatever were shipped, they were shipped mostly in tin boxes or wooden boxes or barrels. Barrels were fairly big, and all of those things were kind of cumbersome. So around the beginning of the 19th century, the manufacturing companies decided that, well, let's try something different. So they took cotton, just unbleached, plain white cotton, and they decided they would sell their products in these. And this is 100-pound, which was a pretty standard size, and this is a real feed sack. And the reason that I'm saying that this is a real feed sack is that most of what's in here are not feed sacks. They're flours or salts or sugars, but the feed sacks were heavy grade so that nothing would fall out. So this is an actually unopened feed sack, but if you see when they're open, they're rather big, and it's a good sized piece of fabric. So as Karen said, the ladies of the household would notice that these were coming along, and then being the kind of resourceful people they said, okay, well, let's make something out of these. So then they started making things like underwear or sheets or diapers or kids' clothes or things like that. The only problem with this a little bit was that a logo might appear in some undesirable place, and then that didn't work very well. People didn't like that. So then the manufacturers came up with a way to not use a stamp on their fabrics. But I just want to show you a few more before I continue. So this is a flower one. Again, the first one was the feed for the animals. And what I want to show you is that some of them were quite local. Well, I guess this is local. It's Waynesboro, Virginia. And then we have the sugar sacks, which were smaller, and the salt, which was even smaller. But they're all still made out of this kind of rough fabric. And some of them were quite attractive. This is one of my favorites. It's kind of cute. I mean, it's all faded now, but it's pretty cute. You wouldn't mind having that in your cupboard. But this is one of my favorites, and I don't know what the year. I always say that I'm going to look up what year this would have been, but this is a sugar sack from Cuba. So this had to be quite a while ago when they were productive sugar growers and producers. So then people wanted to have something more exciting, get those labels off you and stuff. So the manufacturers stopped using them, and they used either a paper label that was, I forgot what this was, a paper label that they could sew on the sack, or water-soluble paper that all they would do is, after the sacks were empty, they would take it and they would put it in water, and that would be, then they would have the nice pieces of fabric. So they came up with some patterns that they started to use. Now, my time frame might not be exactly according to how things went, but this is. So the first prints were kind of plain. Gingham was always very popular. Gingham was in different colors. Gingham was popular. But these are not very exciting. Plaid was popular. And of course, flowers are always popular. And then they did something which was quite smart, I think. So you could buy several feed sacks, and then you could go home and put a hem on it, and you have nice curtains to hang on your window. So, and they also had borders, ones with borders that you could put on your pillows or whatever. So they were very smart in what they did, and the women loved it. So then, now I want to tell you what the anatomy of a quilt sack is. So, a quilt sack is this is the way it looks after you buy your flour or whatever. So what they would do is none of this was really possible. What I'm saying, the clothes that they would make out of these and these things, until the population of the home sewing machine. The factories used the more industrial industrial sewing machines, which were obviously available first. So when you open this up, this is quite a big piece of fabric. And so then they realized, the women realized that they could make more products, maybe skirts or blouses or whatever. And how did they do that without causing problems? They had this, no, I'm not going to find the ones I want, am I? Oh, no, that's not the ones. Here. I even put rubber bands around it so I would know which pack to get into, but I'm still not doing it, right? So they would sew them with, as I said, a heavy sewing machine, industrial sewing machine. And the only reason you can tell when a feed sack is a real feed sack is, as I say, it's sewn along the side and the bottom, is because you have to hold it up and see if you can see the holes. Now, this one I know had holes when I did it. Oh, you did? Okay. Well, they're not straight. They're not the least bit straight. They're all wobbly and everything. But that didn't matter. And so they would make they would put their flour in it, they sew those little lines on the side, and then they would fold it down. But you could have a nice piece. I'm going to pass these around so you can see the holes, because that's what makes them official. This, you can see the holes on this one a little bit better. I don't know if you want to see these, but... wait, where am I? So around this time, we're probably to the mid to late 1920s, still not to the 30s yet. And the cotton industry pretty much was falling. The market was going out of cotton because it was harder, I guess, to produce cotton. And so there was more cotton available, and the manufacturers thought, let's expand a little on our colors. Where's my colors? Well, I guess I did do it wrong. Well, anyway, so, here they are. No, that's not. Sorry. Okay. Okay, so they expanded on their colors. They wanted to get more colors. They wanted to get more patterns, more variety, because the American entrepreneur is very smart, and they saw another opportunity here to make some money. So they expanded the colors, they expanded the patterns, and that's when they came up with having these new colors. Well, new colors compared to what they had. These are all kind of muted. But we have the pink, bubblegum pink, and we have the different shades of blue. And these are, they're just beautiful. Purples and greens.
Still all food?
These are all food.
Okay.
They're all from now. Mostly the grains and the bigger things were in the heavy ones, because when they came up with the new colors and made all these changes, they made the fabrics a lot softer than they were. Those are pretty coarse, and that's why, the little children would go around saying that their little butts were itchy from those scratchy things. So the colors really improved quite a bit here, the patterns, I think. Now, I know, I walked out in the hall, I know there's a ton of feed sacks out there, but these are the ones I have. And so the patterns were, much more involved, and the colors. I mean, look at these colors, orange, yellow, and green all together. I mean, they loved that. That was great. So we're now into the 30s, and as Karen said, they would go to these quilt groups or the bees, and the women would get together, and they could also trade their sacks, their feed sacks. You know, say they needed 3 of them because they needed more, so they could trade them, and then they could make whatever they wanted out of it. And so, what women after this point realized that this was going to be happening a lot, and they wanted dresses. So they didn't want these childish prints. They wanted more sophisticated prints, and that's when they come up with all of these flower ones. Now, I don't know about you, but in the 30s and 40s. I remember seeing, I do remember, in television or magazines or whatever, the ladies always wore these shirtwaist dresses with the little tiny waists and the buttons and the full skirts. Well, you needed 3 to 4 feed sacks to make one of those. And, they didn't want it to be, childish. So they wanted these more exciting colors of the dresses at that time. And then also to get to the quilting part, they would, when they would make whatever they were making, they would cut up their extra pieces for those scrap quilts that Karen was talking about. So they would cut them in different sizes. But like this packet, if you look through here, these are all different. That's an enormous amount of choice for something, and these were all just kind of came with your flower, whatever. So then the ladies would also exchange these and so I had a good time. They quilted. What more could you ask for? You quilted, you exchanged patterns and stuff and designs and whatnot. And again, the quilting was so popular, as Karen was saying, this is the 30s and 40s, that you would find patterns in newspapers, not so magazines, but Simplicities. They started having patterns then too. So you could find, for your nice, sophisticated feed sacks here, you could find nice patterns to make your dresses. So getting into the 50s and 60s, not so much. They didn't want to have, homemade clothes and such. So the companies, the manufacturers, they said, well, we got to still do something, even though people don't want it, because people were moving more to the cities. The economy was getting better, and the manufacturers decided, well, paper will be a lot cheaper than using these fabrics. So they, it wasn't as popular as it was. So they gave it another last ditch effort, kind of, so to speak, of where they made, and these are just incredible in my mind. They made novelty prints. Well, you can make kids' quilts out of this. You can make pillows. You can make, look at this, down on the farm. A little girl's dress out of this one, so cute. Cowboys were very popular. Now, these cowboys, I don't quite understand it. These cowboys are rough and ready cowboys, and they're playing by palm trees. I mean, how did the cowboys get to the palm trees? But, look at the colors on that.
That's because Hawaii became a state in the 50s.
That's true.
The cowboys are called paniolas.
Paniolas?
Hawaiian cowboys.
Oh, Hawaiian cowboys. Well, with the Hawaiian theme, I should have known that, but here we have the little hula girls. How cute are those, right? With the pineapples and everything. And the more of the islands and more palm trees, but no cowboys. But cowboys were very popular, and here's more cowboys, probably based on maybe television.
Hopalong Cassidy.
Right, on television, there's all those cowboys, so, everybody wanted to be
all of that was very
the old buckaroos here. And this is a great color combination too. But this is one of my favorites. This is all fairy tales. So we have the cow jumped over the moon. Humpty Dumpty fell off a wall. Yeah, they are nursery rhymes. So I think this one is fun to kind of look at. And then, of course, since they had all of these novelty ones, they of course had to come up with the one for the St. Patrick's Day, because how can anybody get past a year without celebrating St. Patrick's Day? So that's one of the other ones. So I went to, all right, so here's something from my past here. They used to have an organization called Feed Sack Fanatics. Well, there weren't very many members of it, but I was one of them. Very few. And so this is in the 1990s, and we had the internet then, and you got to be really cool and meet up with other people. Not meet up is a current term, but you found other people on the internet that collected something. So I found these other Feed Sack Fanatics. So quilters have had for quite some time conferences periodically around the country. And so one year there was the one in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. And that's a very big one. And so the little Feed Sack Fanatics there said, well, that would be a good place to go. We didn't want to, mess with the real quilters because we were just a little group. So we met there too, and it was fun. There weren't very many people there, but it was fun. And I got this, and this is all made with feed sacks. It's really seen better days, but I just really like it. And one of the things that I bought when I went to the Feed Sack conference were these little feed sacks, 1.5-inch squares. I said, oh, isn't that adorable? These are 1.5-inch squares, and they're all cut by scissors. No, roller, rotary cutters for them. So I bought these, and then when I got home and I had to explain why did I buy these, I said, because I'm going to make this quilt. All right, so I'm going to make this quilt. Well, I started sewing together these little 1.5-inch squares, and I said, oh, Maureen, I don't know if you have enough time. So another thing that they sold around the 30s and 40s were penny squares. I said, okay, well, I'm going to do some penny squares. But penny squares, if you're familiar with them, they're real cute, but they're kind of funny faces and stuff. It's Kate Greenway does them, and what's her name? Sunbonnet Sue, and days of the week. On Mondays I cook. Tuesdays I shop. Things I didn't really do very much, so I didn't want that. So I decided I was going to do Raggedy Ann and Andy. So I did Raggedy Ann and Andy, and this is the way I did my 1.5-inch squares. And this didn't take near as long. So I was very pleased with it.
Or did you buy these patterns?
No, a coloring book. I found a coloring book. So, coloring books are great if you ever want to do anything like that. So I then started using my feed sacks, the ones that I'm willing to cut, for backing. And this is some turkey red, vintage turkey red fabric. So I was real pleased with the way it came out, and those.
Let's see. You want me to take one side or you got it?
So I don't really recommend 1.5-inch squares. I know people like Mary Frankel back there. And those two back there, they would jump right on 1.5-inch squares. Not me. Okay, And I got these little aprons. How cute are these little aprons? Well, the thing that's really cute about these little aprons is this particular stitch here is called chicken scratch, and they're not sewn. All the sewing, the only thing that holds these together is these little chicken scratches. So I thought these were cute. You can pass these around because they're so cute. Okay, well, so feed sacks now. Let me see. Feed sacks now with quilting, as Karen said again, it's very cyclical. So, something goes out of fashion, it comes back at another time. And so then they started making reproduction feed sacks and reproduction 1930s fabrics. And so you can still find them now if you wanted to, because Feed Sack Fanatics, although they're not an active group anymore, does have a little web page where they sell feed sacks if you want them. And sometimes you can find them at, yard sales or whatever. But they're fun. They're really fun. Okay, that's all. Sure. I don't know. Okay.
When they started putting their feed in the feed sacks and selling it, did they charge more for it?
No, that's the way it came. That's the way they sold them. Once they started with the cloth bags, that's the way they sold it. Because they was much more transportable in the smaller sacks, and it was didn't take up as much space as those big old drums. And one thing about the, I'm sorry?
What a bargain.
Oh, thank you. Oh, my 1.5-inch squares, I don't want to lose those. But the one thing about, I'm sorry, just one more thing. I did want to say that when they did change from the barrels to the cloth bags, they did try to keep as much as possible the logos in a circle, because that's what was on the top of the barrels. Okay. I'm just going to...
Who designed all the colors and the print?
Well, they had when they had the expansion, they hired designers, and for just this purpose, and that was the time when they were learning more about dyes, because the first ones, I'm just going to move this over here. The first ones, when they started dyeing them, a lot of dye. Oh, sheesh!
It's okay.
A lot of dyes ran or didn't hold up, but these new colors that they made with the later, progression, these colors don't run. You can throw these. These are all, not all, but many of them have already been washed, and they don't run. And that's so when they got to the point where their colors, color fast. Thank you. So that was, they could expand their colors, expand their patterns.
Thank you. Hi there. I live in Newbern, so I started this journey in the early, probably 1990. And so my husband and I have a Civil War business, so I started out with more Civil War flags and uniforms that I did restoration and conservation work on, but my grandmother was a quilter. And so I quilted myself from the time, I started sewing when I was 6. And so I was fascinated by fabrics. And one of the first textile conferences I went to, a woman spoke about feed sacks. And I went home and said to my mother, "Do you know anything about this?" And she was like, "Of course I do, And she was born in this is my sister over here, 1924. And so she said, of course, she said, she did not sew. She hated to sew. It skipped a generation. But my grandmother loved to sew. And she said, your granny made, lots and lots of your little play outfits out of them. And then I started looking around, and you know how you didn't put your food away in the refrigerator after dinner, midday meal. Granny would just cover it with, and I remembered it was a feed sack. They were used as what we would consider tea towels, hand towels. And I started looking, and she said, yeah, remember this? This is a feed sack. And so I have been doing this history thing, and if any of you are interested in quilt history, I know Jan's a member of American Quilt Study Group, and it is a fabulous organization that is based out of Lincoln, Nebraska, and we have conferences every year, and people from all over the world come. And so that is something if you are interested. So I then evolved into a quilt person, and that's a whole nother story that we'll talk about later, because I researched North Carolina produced plaids. And so I jumped into that, and that has become one of my big focuses. So my biggest focus are Southern quilts. But as far as starting a little bit further back with some of the history, one of the reasons they were using barrels and other items, wooden boxes. I don't know if they were using tin boxes or not, but anyway, and a lot of jars, crockery, pottery to transport, to store things. And with the invention of the sewing machine in the 1850s, they finally had a machine that could stitch the fabric across the top. And they started out with chain stitching machines, and they also then later on went to the two locking bobbin process. So that's when they could start making bags to transport their products, the flour, the feed, the salt, the sugar. And so with that, they started doing these bags. Well, of course, they needed to identify them some way. Well, after the Civil War, the printing industry just exploded because we had had the Industrial Revolution in the early mid-1800s that was doing a tremendous amount with gears and machinery and textiles. But the printing was good, but it really took off after the Civil War. So I was actually part of a exhibit that was done at UNCW. The Cameron Art Museum did this, and one of their instructors in graphic arts did an entire exhibit on the evolution of printing on textiles and how they would do their logos and how that was, became the brand identity, and that people, could then see that at the museum here, I have been studying the collection and trying to let Pam and Karen know the names of the patterns, dating the quilts more accurately, and just trying to figure out history that's associated with some of these quilts that they have in the collection. And they have some wonderful things, and 3 quilts that stand out in my mind, but there were more. I think there might have been 5 or 6 actually had these kind of sacks on the back of quilts. And it was interesting because most of the time, this particular one they would usually bleach them. They wanted to get that writing out as much as they could. But then what they would do, if they couldn't bleach it out real well, okay, we've got pretty good here, they would do the back. So you wouldn't read it quite as well, but there was one particular one I was looking at, and it was interesting because it was from Newbern, and I thought I could read Newbern, but what you do is you take a mirror and you hold it up and it'll reverse the letters, and then you can read them. And then the other thing was with this chain stitching that they had at the top, and they continued with the chain stitch because it was easy to pull the thread and open it up. A lot of the women, my mother-in-law was a Styrne from Atlantic, And she always had little bits, balls of thread, or she would take, part of a cereal box and fold it over a few times and then wrap thread around it. And it's a heavier thread. We grew up on a tobacco farm, so it's more the thickness of tobacco twine. It's not like you would get Coats and Clark's, sewing machine thread. And this particular one is a quilt that I took apart. I think that there were 3 other quilts inside of it. And so this is the thickness of the thread. So what they did with that is they would make a nice, pretty thin quilt, because the quilts of the 1800s were much thinner. And then it would start to wear out. So they'd slap another top on it and maybe another back. And they might be able to quilt that one with some pretty good big stitching going on. But by the time you then cover it another 3rd time, you could not quilt that thing. And so that's when you really started doing a lot of these ties. And they did use those particular twines. So then back to the mid-1800s is really when they started doing a lot of the printing. Probably 1880-ish was when they were doing a lot of the printing on the sacks. And the other thing was the tobacco industry was really growing, and they wanted to encourage men to smoke. Women did not like it one bit. It was smelly, it was dirty, and it just wasted a lot of their money. So they wanted those men to stop buying those little packs of tobacco from Durham, primarily. And so they were like, we got to figure out a way to talk these women into liking this stuff. And so what they started doing is they would put these little flannels, or they would do little silks. And I meant to bring some silks, and I didn't get the opportunity to get those. But they would have little silks that would have flowers, flags. Later on in the around 1915, I've got a lot of them. I've got a pillow that is made of silent movie stars. And so they would have these pretty, sexy looking women who were silent movie stars. And so all these women, it would be their Vogue magazine or their Cosmopolitan or 17 magazine, whatever. They all wanted those. There were birds. It was also a good way that they were saying, teach your children. These children really need to know about flags and birds and things. And then they were doing baseball kind of like baseball cards. And they did later on do baseball cards, but they'd had even ribbons with that. And so, of course, Daddy was saying, oh, honey, these are so educational for our children. So I need to buy another 2 or 3 packs of cigarettes, and then, and it was mainly the loose tobacco that was wrapped in those little tiny sacks. That was another kind of sack that women ended up using quite a bit. They were the little white, little gauzy sacks, and they would open those up and then turn them into the back of a pillow or whatever. So it really is economics. They did not, and so that's with the flour sacks and the feed sacks. That came about in the 1920s. And a lot of the reason for that was because in 1957, Perkins accidentally, he got coal tar spilled on him, and it was purple. And he went, oh my goodness. And that was the beginning of synthetic dyes. So then the synthetic dyes kept evolving, but they weren't always great. They were not always real color fast, and they couldn't get a really good black. So if you see a quilt that has a lot of black in it, probably kind of something like this with the gray and the black polka dots, or something like that. They started calling those mourning, mourning, mourning prints. And it was 1885 when they could finally do synthetic blacks that would hold. Up until then, the blacks were using very acidic dyes, and they would end up breaking the fibers down after a while. So that is when that was going on, and so they started getting better with their colors, and they had some good reds. Of course, a lot of times those reds would turn brown after you washed them in lye soap. I have a quilt that was our great-grandmother's probably. She probably made it around 1900, and I'm sure that woman went to the store and bought red. She came home and she started working on this and was going to do these sashes between all these little blocks, and she ran out of her red, so she had to go back to the store and get some more red. And so she finished up her quilt, and it's one of my favorite quilts. It's just a beautiful pattern, very simple, but it was supposed to have all these cross hatches of red and then just really frame these nice new fabrics she had. Well, I'm sure she washed it in her wash pot in lye soap, and when she put it on that clothesline, the sun got to it, and she walked out there and probably said lots of things that a woman of that time shouldn't have said. Because all that sashing, one of it was natural dyed turkey red. The other part was a synthetic red, usually called Congo red. And she was one mad mama. So you had a lot of that, and you'd have greens that would turn to these browns, khaki colors. And so they were still playing with colors. Well, war can do a lot of different things, and I don't think that we all understand how it can affect so many things of our daily life that we think that, oh, that just happened. No, there was a reason for it. Germany, for some reason, they have much better chemists who could create really good dyes. At the end of World War I, they were forced to give up their dye recipes so that we could end up getting those wonderful colors. Us, England, other countries that were producing fabrics. The colors of fabrics exploded around 1920. And that's when we saw this, all your beautiful colors. That's when that started coming about. Because they had finally gotten in 1885 and 1900, they were doing good reds, good blues, good blacks. They were getting some burgundies. So if you see quilts in that time period, you go, oh, okay, that's about 1890 to 1910. But then by the 20s, they got these great synthetic dyes, and they could do these wonderful pastels. And they were tired of brown quilts. They were tired of the black. They wanted something bright. It was the time of the Depression. They wanted something that was nice and pretty, and the producers sent it out to them. So in the 20s is when these feed sacks started. It was totally a marketing ploy. They didn't give a whoop if those women needed or wanted some good fabric. They wanted their feed sacks to sell. And I am sure that they probably did increase their price a little bit. They had to. They had to compensate for that extra that was put into them. But the women didn't care. They would pay an extra nickel for that bag if they also could get a pretty dress out of it or their children's clothes. Yeah. So, and they would tell their husbands, it was like with the tobacco. Don't just buy 3, because with the tobacco stuff, I want to finish this pillow because Cousin Louise is coming to visit and she needs to see these pretty pillows I've been making. And it would have been the same thing with that. And we did see a lot of the flower sacks. Here's one, and I've got one. I thought I had picked it up, but I didn't. But here's a primary example, and Bonnie has some great ones. So I want to hurry this up because I want Bonnie to show some of her beautiful things she has from her family. And they would glue labels like this onto that pretty bag. Wouldn't that have been beautiful, stacked up at the general store? And she would say to her husband when he left, okay, I need some chicken feed, because a lot of the chicken feed was packed in those pretty, colorful bags, and that's how women got their scratch money. It was called chicken scratch. That was what the crushed up corn was, and that's how they got their scratch money, was by tending the chickens and selling eggs. So that is, it just grew and grew and grew, and then the companies actually started making cute little patterns that you could buy for a dime or a nickel of how to turn this into an apron, you know, and so that would probably be stuffed in their sack. So once you opened it up, that got that string going, then you had a little piece of paper and you'd go, oh my goodness, I can send off of these pretty patterns for 5 cents. And also home extension clubs were starting during this time in the 40s, 30s and 40s. So there's just so many things. And we are very fortunate at the Corsow Museum. I think it looks like there's a lot of interest. I think we can really let this grow. There are a bunch of quilts there with the feed sack cloth in them. And so I think that that's exciting, but you can see the ones that are on the back that are rough like this. But let me see, one of them was for something, linseed. Yeah, it was a kind of feed that had linseed oil in it. But I will end with this. This is not at the museum, but the museum does have some wonderful things. And it did go on until in the Midwest, they were still making the sacks up until around 1970. And that's because that was a whole different population. Probably around here, it was around 1960. But this is just one of my favorite pieces that I own. And a lot of this was made from that fabric. But don't think it all came from a sack, because these companies that were producing these textiles were not just doing sacks. They were doing yardage. And so you can also get it in yardage, and it became a much finer. When I started off with this, people would say to me, now you can identify this because it's a more coarse fabric. It was in the beginning, but they got to the place it was smooth, you know, fine cotton that these women wanted to make their children's clothes out of and their house dresses. And so, you know, that was perfect. And I know you said the house dresses started at 40, but my granny was wearing house dresses up until the late 60s. She didn't have grass in her yard. She'd sweep her yard, and she would sweep her yard in little stacked heel shoes, her house dress, and a sweater, and then she'd wear my papa's. No, she didn't wear a bonnet, Mary. She wore my papa's felt Stetson. But if company was coming up, boy, she got that hat off in a skinny minute. But so anyway, that's my introduction, was through this woman, Nora Pate. But no, the Corsow Museum is going to, I think, become someplace that people will talk about in North Carolina. You know, they've got a great quilt collection. So, thank you.